So I'm delighted to welcome back Professor Dave Goulson, who's going to talk to us about the Big B Hotel experiment and the work of the Buzz Club at Sussex University. So over to you, Dave.
Thanks, Kieran. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Nice to see so many people interested in bee hotels. I've got quite a lot to cover, but thought it's still worth a little bit of a preamble before I specifically talk about bee hotels. Um, a bit of background as to why we might want to put up a bee hotel and encourage bees. So Bees are very diverse. Many people possibly think there's only a handful of species of bee, and they immediately think of the honeybee if you mention bees, which is actually a really weird species of bee that lives in these huge, long-lived colonies. The majority of bee species are solitary bees, which means a female bee makes a nest on her own. It may be a hole in the ground, it may be a hole in a dead tree, it may be a bee hotel, which we'll come to in a second. There are over 20,000 species of bee in the world. They've been around for somewhere in the region of 120 million years. So there's a spectacular diversity, and I've just put up some lovely examples there. Six of those nine are British bee species. You can probably work out which ones aren't. Anyway, you don't need me to tell you this, I'm sure, but bees are important. Along with other pollinating insects, they ensure that our supermarkets remain full of lots of fruit and veg. 75% of the crops we grow in the world need pollinating by some kind of insect to give a good harvest. So take away the bees and other pollinators and things wouldn't look so good and we couldn't feed everybody. So we should be concerned that um, that insects, including bees, are broadly in decline. I'm not going to dwell on this at all today, but this is just one piece of evidence, one of the better known studies. It's actually from Germany, where keen entomologists trapped flying insects in malaise traps. That's what that thing is, top right. From 1989 onwards, and the chart shows the decline in the biomass of insects caught per trap per day. Fell by 76% on average in a 27-year period, which is pretty terrifying, but as far as we can tell, isn't something that's peculiar to Germany, but is happening all around the world, or at least wherever we've got good data. So that's the sort of background. This is what motivates me to want to do something to help. And one of the things, there are lots of things we can do to help insects. Ideally, we need to change the way we farm. It would be a huge one. But on a much smaller scale, if we have a garden of our own or any kind of outdoor space, then we can do something to help insects, bees and butterflies and beetles and so on, by inviting them into our gardens, into our roof terraces, if that's all we have. Or if you haven't got a garden, you could badger the local authority to manage the local parks and road verges and roundabouts in a more insect-friendly way. And I think there's a really exciting opportunity that lots of people are engaged with, of turning our cities and villages and whatnot into a kind of national network of nature reserves. We've got 22 million private gardens in the UK, and just imagine if they were all insect friendly, that would be a huge step in the right direction. And it's kind of happening and already, which makes it exciting. There are loads of people engaging with this. Sorry for plugging my own books. I can never resist. But if you want to know more about the general principles of gardening for insects, I've written some books about it. One of them's a bestseller. Anyway, enough of me. Um, there's an interesting aspect of wildlife gardening is that a lot of it is based on anecdote rather than hard evidence. There are lots of books about wildlife gardening, lots of people online on YouTube and whatnot dishing out advice about how to attract more insects to your garden. But often they're guessing. They don't actually know what works best because there's no scientific evidence. Um, and so that's why about 8 years ago we started the Buzz Club from University of Sussex, which is a citizen science club which aims to involve members of the public from all around the UK and a few beyond, um, in testing out different things we might do in the garden to see what really works and doing it in a scientific way with controls and so on, so that we can build an evidence base and give people sound advice as to what will be effective and what's a waste of time. So, for example, a project I'd love to launch next year is looking at whether no mow May is really a good idea, or would it be better if it was no May June or no mow July or whatever. Um, there are lots of bug hotels on sale in garden centres, things like butterfly hibernation boxes and ladybird houses and so on. And I'm pretty dubious about whether many of these actually work. So the Buzz Club's running projects testing out some of these things. In the middle, bottom middle, there is a hoverfly lagoon, which is something uh, we've been we've been testing out, and it's a project you could get involved in if you wanted. But today is all about bee hotels, and that's another area where there are loads of bee hotel designs available. You go to any garden centre or look online, you can see dozens of different bee hotels on offer. Um, do they work? Are they worth bothering with? And if so, which ones are best? That's basically what we've been trying to find out at the Buzz Club and what I'm going to be talking about today. So there are lots of different types of ways of making a bee hotel. These are hotels intended to provide a home for what are commonly called cavity nesting bees. These are solitary bees, um, which in nature would probably nest in hollow stems of something like bramble or ragwort, the dead stems, um, or in beetle holes left in a rotting tree trunk. They're probably fairly opportunistic, and it may well be that because particularly there aren't many dead trees in the landscape these days, we tend to tidy them away, that holes are in short supply. Also, general tidying and deadheading in the garden would remove hollow stems. And if they are in short supply, then providing artificial holes may benefit the population of these cavity nesting bees. So there's just a few different designs. Top left is a commercial bee hotel design. Bottom left is a selection of ones made by a group of school children using bits of bamboo. And on the right there is a really ugly thing I made in my garden just by drilling some holes in a fence post. They're all different ways of providing holes for cavity nesting bees, potentially. Um, Now, before I go on to talking about the experiment we've done, let's just look in a bit more detail at the bee species that you might expect to turn up. And this is from a UK perspective. If you're from the US or tuning in from somewhere else in the world, then this might not be quite so relevant to you. So I apologize, but I'm not going to spend too long on this. Anyway, um, by far, the commonest bee that may occupy bee hotels in the UK is the one top right there, the red mason bee. They're on the wing right now, as we shall see, and busy nesting. The other similar species you might see, which I get plenty of in my garden, is the blue mason bee, which is a roughly similar shaped insect. Um, in the photograph there, bottom left, you can see a sort of bluish tinge. It's often not very obvious. It usually looks more like a black bee than a blue bee. But anyway, it's distinctive enough that you can probably spot them if you have them around. So the red mason bee, anyway, is the main occupant of most people's bee hotels. It's called a mason bee because it collects mud, carries mud back from wherever it can find it. It sort of packs it onto its face. You can see that bee flying in there. It's got a kind of lump under its head. That's a ball of mud that it's collected, and it uses that to construct cells and a final plug within the tunnel of the bee hotel. Um, Mason bee um, nests are fairly easy to spot because when they finally plug them up, they do it very messily. So it's a very textured finish. They don't bother smoothing the mud down in a very professional way. They just kind of lob in lumps until it's all blocked. So those are a selection of Mason B tubes. Um, the different colors are just different soils that the bee has collected. What's what's happening behind the plug is really interesting and not something you can easily see unless you build or buy a specifically designed bee hotel with a window. This that on the left there is a commercial design of bee hotel by a company called Nurturing Nature, which I think is now defunct, sadly, run by a wonderful guy called George Pilkington. Anyway, on the right there, it shows you what you can see if you open that little hatch, and these are red mason bee nests. So the bee goes to the starts off at the bottom of the tunnel. Where are we? And it makes a little pile of pollen and it lays an egg and then it builds, if you can see my mouse there, then it builds a little clay wall and seals in the bottom one and repeats until the tunnel is full and then it plugs up the end with the mud we saw a moment ago. So the oldest bee, baby bee is at the bottom and they tend to lay females at the bottom and then male eggs nearer the entrance. Because the youngest bees near the entrance have to emerge before the ones in the bottom for obvious reasons. And in most insects, including bees, the males like to emerge early so that they're kind of ready to go when the virgin females emerge, and the males will eagerly pounce on them the second they crawl out of the tunnel. So you tend to find male offspring near the entrances and the females in the deeper recesses of these nests. Okay, so that's the mason bees. Moving on. Oh, sorry, that's mud. It's the first time I've done this talk, bear with me. That's mud as a building material. The blue mason bee, rather than using mud, uses chewed up leaf mastic to make a kind of paste. Um, does the same thing in terms of building cells inside the tunnel, but the entrance plug is much neater and often a greenish color. You can see the one on the left there is a dark greenish color. One on the right is used some other plant material that's yellowish, but it's concave and it's much smoother. And so from the plug, we can get a pretty good idea of what bee has nested in that hole. Um, the other main occupants of bee hotels are the leafcutter bees. Um, there are several different species in the UK. The three commonest ones are on the screen. Leafcutter bees snip semicircles of leaf and use those to separate the cells within the tunnel and to plug up the entrance. So there we have a couple of completed tunnels and a bee just carrying a leaf in as it's building a third tunnel. The entrance plug tends to be really messy with obvious fragments of leaf, sometimes poking out at sort of awkward angles like you can see there, bottom right. These are pretty common and they tend to be on the wing a bit later in the year than the mason bees, as we shall see in a moment. Then just to finish off, there are a few other more unusual residents of bee hotels, the more common of which I've put up pictures of here. So for example, there's a thing called the large-headed resin bee, which many people have never heard of, but I actually get quite a lot of them in my bee hotels. I live in the southeast of the UK. You don't get these in the north. Um, these are just these are quite small bees, so they tend to use the smaller holes. Also, there's the large scissor bee, which I've not had in my garden, but I know people that have. Despite the name, it's not very large. Another small, slender bee that's easily overlooked. You might also be lucky and see yellow-faced bees. Which have very sensible names. They're distinctive bright yellow face markings. There are several species, but the common yellow face bees, not as the name suggests, is the most common. And you may, if you're lucky, also find mason wasps. Um, which are rather similar to mason bees in that they use clay or soil to build cells and to plug up holes. But instead of stocking them with pollen, they're stocking them with paralyzed insects or spiders as food for their offspring. The large-headed resin bee makes quite a distinctive plug. These are I took this photograph on the bee hotels just outside where I'm sitting. Um, so they use resin, which is why they're called resin bees, usually from pine trees. But then they stud it with little tiny pebbles, which is quite distinctive. So something to keep an eye out for if you've got a bee hotel. So that's just a quick rough run through sort of the the main types of bee that you might see in a bee hotel. Um, I realize that's rather rushed, and for many people, these are species that you've probably never seen before. If you really want to get into identifying the bees in your bee hotel or generally in your garden, if you're UK based, I highly recommend this book by Stephen Falk. It's a really nice guide and will help you work out what some of the little critters are that might turn up in your garden on flowers or bee hotels or whatever. Okay, so that's a kind of preamble. Let's get on to talking about the nitty-gritty of what we've been up to. So mainly today, I'm going to be talking about the Big Bee Hotel experiment, which is a citizen science project run by the Buzz Club, run specifically by Isabel Sexton. You can see top right there. I have to give her full credit for running this project for the last year, gathering all the data, processing the photographs, and even to the extent of analyzing the data and plotting graphs for me. So she really deserves all the credit here, not I. Anyway, so the Big Bee Hotel experiment is all about getting members of the public to try out a bee hotel in their garden and then take a photograph every month of the face of the hotel from which we can work out from the plugs and what, as I've just talked about, the distinctive styles of plug made by different types of insect. We can look at how many holes are occupied and by which type of insect, roughly. And as long as we get a photograph of each hotel through the spring and summer, then we can look at the pattern of occupancy of the holes, how it changes over time, the relative abundance of different species, how it's affected by where the hotel is sited, and so on. So we started this a year ago. So we've got a year's worth of data so far, and we're running it again this year. Please do consider joining in. I'll send you a link at the end of the talk to the website if you want to register. This project is partly funded by the Eva Crane Trust. Thanks to them. And it's also sponsored by the wildlife community who manufacture bee hotels. You can get a discount if you want to buy a bee hotel to use in the Big Bee Hotel project. And you can also, if you do enter the project, you can opt to be entered in a free prize draw where the wildlife community are giving a £250 voucher to anyone that takes part. As if helping us help the bees isn't enough motivation, you might get a £250 voucher. Okay. So what we want to do by gathering data from bee hotels all around the country is basically work out which design of hotel is best, which is the best material to make it from, what size holes should you use, does the shape of the hole matter, does the depth of the hole matter, what's the best place to put your bee hotel, should it be south, north facing, how high off the ground? There's a whole raft of questions for which we don't have solid evidence-based answers. So that's what we've been trying to find out. So what have we found? Well, so last year, 2024, we had 594 hotels registered, of which 487 we managed to get a usable data set on occupancy rates. So a few fell by the wayside. And in total, there was a quite impressive 7,293 occupied holes in the hotels that took part in the study. Um, 83% of those were plugged up with mud, so mason bees, by far the most abundant, as we would have expected. They always seem to be the most common occupants of these hotels. Then 7% were some kind of leafcutter bee, and 9% were using leaf mastic. So most commonly, probably blue mason bees, but there are one or two other species that also use leaf mastic. And on average, overall, 27% of holes were occupied, which I think is pretty good. Um, I, I I think it's pretty clear, actually, before we go any further, that bee hotels do basically work. Unlike some of the other kind of bug hotels, which I'm not sure do work, bee hotels, on average, get bees living in them. Doesn't always work. I've met people who've hung them up and had no occupancy at all. But the majority of bee hotels do get some occupants, and many get quite a lot. Um, anyway, so this just shows you the distribution of people that took part and sent us useful data sets right up to from the tip of Cornwall to Orkney in the north. Could do with a few more people from Northern Ireland and Scotland, but it's a pretty good geographic coverage, which if you break it down by hotel type, this just shows you that we've got the orange ones were bought hotels from companies other than the wildlife community. The red ones are homemade hotels, and the blue ones are wildlife community hotels. In terms of the timing of occupancy of nests, you can see that actually we are now in peak bee activity season. Um, so most nests are filled in April and May, and then it really drops off rapidly after that. And actually, the number of new holes filled per month becomes negative in September, which you might wonder how on earth you can have a negative number of holes occupied. But of course, it's because some holes that were occupied become unoccupied by probably mainly because some birds peck out the grubs closest to the surface. Woodpeckers can reach in somewhere in the region of about 7 centimeters and fish out all the grubs that they can reach. And I get greater spotted woodpeckers in my garden attacking my bee hotels. Um, if you remember the thing about the gender of the females being at the bottom, it actually means that it's mostly male bees that get eaten by birds, which from a bee population perspective, it's probably no bad thing because males don't do a lot that's terribly useful in solitary bees. They just hang around hassling females. Um, so the loss of a few males is probably not too much to worry about. Anyway, so that shows you when bee hotels are occupied and is an incentive if you're thinking of putting up a bee hotel and ideally putting one up and joining the big bee hotel experiment for this year, then you need to get a shift on because the bees are out there right now. In terms of the different types of plug, this shows you the cumulative occupancy of holes with mud, leaves, or leaf mastic. And you can see again the massive predominances of holes being filled with mud. And the leaves and the mastic filled holes tend to come later uh, in June onwards. Um, after the mason bees, the brown bars have started to decline. That decline, as I say, is due to probably primarily due to bird predation. Um, okay, so in terms of questions we want answers to, one of the simplest is what is there an optimum place to attach your bee hotel? We had hotels attached to a number of different things, fences, sheds, trees, walls, and so on. And I remember being told many years ago by George Pilkington, the guy I mentioned earlier, that it's a bad idea to put a bee hotel on a tree. And he said the main reason for that was because he thinks they fill up with earwigs if you put them on trees. Earwigs commonly run up and down tree trunks, whereas they're not so common on walls and fences. So he advised me against putting bee hotels on a tree, and it looks like he knew what he was talking about. Um, so the dots, the colored dots show you the sort of mean occupancy of hotels placed on different substrates. Substrates, perhaps not the right word, fixed to different things. Um, and you can see that sheds and fences and walls all do fairly well. But trees are the red dot there. That's statistically significantly lower than the average. So that's a useful place tip. Don't attach a bee hotel to a tree. How high should it be above the ground? Um, well, actually, within the range, we had hotels anywhere between sitting on the ground um, up to over 2 meters in the air. And actually, there is no, if you look at that, each dot is a hotel. There's no real pattern at all. Statistically, there is no relationship. So it seems that bee hotels can be pretty much any height within reach. We obviously can't say what would happen if you put them higher than 2 meters. Perhaps it would tail off, perhaps it wouldn't. We didn't have any hotels, so we don't know. But it clearly isn't too critical what height you hang them between naught and 2 meters. Should you put them in a sunny spot or a shady spot? I've always advised people to put them in the sun, and it turns out that that is sensible advice. It seems like people have already been listening because very few hotels were put in full shade. Those are shown on the left there. There were only 6 of them. And some of those were quite well occupied. As you can see, there's two higher dots, but on average, the ones in shade didn't do so well, and the ones in full sun did best. So as it does matter whether you put your hotels in sun or shade, it would seem. Put them in the sun if you can. Relating to that, so this is sun or shade, which is obviously closely related to whether they're facing north, south, east, or west. Sorry, this is a bit of a bombardment of charts and graphs and so on. Please bear with me. So this shows you the proportion of occupied nests according to the direction the nests are facing. And the simple take-home message here is that north, northwest, and west all perform pretty poorly. So don't put a bee hotel on a north or west facing wall. Whereas south and east both seem to be pretty good. So it seems that bees seem to appreciate the morning sun on their nest. Perhaps it helps to get them warm and active early in the day so that they can gather lots of food. But they don't seem so interested in the evening sun. So again, I think that's useful practical advice about where to put your bee hotel. In terms of location, we've got one other question, which was we asked people to tell us whether their hotel was sheltered from the rain or not. That doesn't seem to make any difference at all. We've got ones that were sheltered versus ones that were unsheltered, and you can see there's basically both of them equally good or bad. Doesn't seem to make the blind bit of difference as far as the bees are concerned. A further question we pondered was, is it a good thing if you've got lots of other hotels, or does that dilute the number of occupants you get um, uh, in any extra bee hotel you add into your garden? It doesn't look like there's much of a pattern to me, but surprisingly, statistically, there is a slight decline in occupancy of any particular hotel if you have lots of other hotels. You can see some people had as many as 16 different hotels in their garden, and people with more hotels tended to have a slightly lower occupancy overall, which I think is interesting, but requires a bit of further investigation to work out what's going on. Okay, so I mentioned Wildlife Community, and they provide a whole, they'll sell on their online website a whole range of bee hotels, and quite a few of the people that took part in the project bought one of their hotels and sent us data on how they did. Um, so um, we thought it'd be interesting to have a look at the relative success of these different bee hotel designs. I haven't put up all of their range at all here, but the four photographs show you four examples of different bee hotels that they sell. And the chart shows you the occupancy. I have to say, and this is an important point to stress, that we have a very low sample size here for most of these designs. All of the ones on the left of the chart, we only had one, two, or three hotels being used, which is a very small sample size and probably not enough to tell us much about how good they are. The only two nests for which we had a good sample size were the ones in the two blue bars on the right there. Um, these rather attractive models here, bottom right. And they worked pretty well. About 28, 30% or so occupancy, which is pretty good, slightly above average. The others, it's hard to say much about, but it would be really nice to get more people using them this coming year to see whether they are really effective or not. At the moment, we can't really say. But if you do want to buy a commercial hotel, we've got clear evidence that the ones bottom right do work. Okay. Um, One of the other questions one might ask is what is the best material to make a bee hotel from, whether you're buying it or making it yourself? Um, this is a rather cluttered chart, but the most common material used was wood on the right, and they seem to work fairly well for bee hotels. And then second most common material was bamboo, which also seemed to work well. That's on the left-hand side of the chart. Cardboard was good. Um, Actually performed on average slightly better than wood or bamboo. And when I say cardboard, these are hotels using a cardboard tubes packed within some kind of waterproof case. Um, so any of those seem to be good. The ones that in the middle, we didn't have big sample sizes. I have no idea what I didn't even know you could get metal bee hotels, but apparently you can. But none of these plastic, concrete, metal seem to perform particularly well. So I think sticking with wood, bamboo, or cardboard seems like the best bet. What else have we got? Hole depth. Uh, People often say you should have deep holes, not least because that provides more room for more bees, more baby bees. It also means that more of them are beyond the reach of woodpeckers. Um, but simply in terms of occupancy, the number of holes um, plugged up, there's no relationship between the depth of the hole and the likelihood that it gets filled by a bee. Um, so of course, that doesn't mean the whole depth isn't important. A deep hole full of baby bees is going to have more baby bees in it than a shallow hole. So if the number of holes filled is the same, that does mean there's probably more bees, more offspring in deeper hotels. Um, I think that probably needs there's other aspects to this which we haven't fully explored yet. For example, with deep hotels, are they completely filled or do the bees start halfway along rather than crawling right to the end of a deep hotel? I've certainly seen in some hotels with windows on the side examples where the bees didn't use the full depth of the hole. So yeah, there's some uncertainties there. Um, okay, I think this is the one of the final bits of result we had from the Big B hotel experiment. We also looked at the size of the hotel in terms of the number of holes it had, and does that affect the proportion of holes that are occupied? And it doesn't seem to make a blind bit of difference, which basically means that if you have twice as many holes in your hotel, then you can expect roughly twice as many holes twice as many occupied holes. So there's a linear relationship between the two, which means that, of course, more holes is better because if on average 27% of them are occupied, regardless of how many holes there are, then the more holes the better in terms of number of bees. Hope that made sense. Crikey, we are honestly coming nearly to the end. I think this is the penultimate results slide from the Big Bee Hotel experiment. Um, this is just a comparison of bought designs from any source with homemade designs, and it doesn't make any difference at all. You can see there are good and bad among both. Um, if you've got no DIY skills, bought hotels are perfectly effective. But don't be put off making them yourself because many DIY hotels were occupied by lots of bees. Okay, now on to a controversial question. Should you clean out your hotel? Um, it's early days because we've only been running this project for 1 year, but I thought it would be important to at least touch on this because it's often one of the questions that I'm asked about bee hotels. What you're looking at in this picture here is um, a cell, a mason bee cell, which is overrun by pollen mites. Those little tiny grain-like things are little arachnids, which you can often see on mason bees and other bees for that matter, but most commonly on red mason bees. And this poor thing is plastered with mites. And so these mites hitchhike on the bees. If they're on a male bee, they jump onto a female bee when they mate. And then when the female bee makes a nest and stocks it with pollen, the mites jump off onto the pollen. And if there are lots of them, they eat uh, the pollen, and therefore the young bee starves to death. Um, and you can get huge infestations of pollen mites in bee hotels. It also looks pretty grim, I have to say. But it's not just pollen mites. There are lots of other natural enemies that will be attracted by the bees nesting in a bee hotel. Things like these little tiny fruit fly-sized flies called the Houdini fly, because they have a strange inflatable head capsule that they use to push their way out when they want to escape the nest. Bottom there shows some of the fly maggots, and they're similar um, to the pollen mites in that they eat the pollen, but they also then, if they run out of pollen, actually eat the baby bee, which you might not like, but it's natural. It's part of nature, and I think we should celebrate this diversity. People find it easier to love some of the more spectacular wasp parasitoids of solitary bee uh, hotel residents, things like this rather magnificent wasp with this amazing ovipositor, which it uses to jab eggs into the baby bees. Um, and the jewel wasps. This is a British species. I get these in my garden, but incredibly beautiful. They look like they should be some sort of exotic tropical beast. Um, anyway, in terms of what we've found, so here we've got a comparison of hotels that are either brand new. So let me just waggle my mouse at them. So the orange one dot there is brand new hotels. Next to it on the left are hotels that haven't been cleaned out, left from the previous year. And left of that, the green dot is hotels that were cleaned out every year. Now, there is a statistically significant difference here. You can see that the hotels that weren't cleaned out had more occupied holes on average than the ones that were cleaned out. Also interesting that new hotels tend to have fewer occupied holes, suggesting that maybe it takes a year or two for the bee population to build up in a new hotel. Um, anyway, it's early days, and we want to run the project again for a number of years and track individual hotels to see how um, cleaning them out or not affects the long-term population of mason bees and other bee hotel occupants. But at the moment, the data suggest that cleaning out your hotel is not productive. in terms of increasing the number of holes that are occupied. Okay, the very final question, which you might have, people often ask is what size what size hole do bees prefer? Um, we actually ran a separate experiment on this called Airbnb, which was run by Linda Burke in there, top right, for the last 2 years, a smaller scale project, but with about 90 participants from around the UK. And this was just specifically looking at hole diameter, varying hole diameter from 6 to 10 millimeters, and looking at how that affected occupancy. Um, and so here we have smallest holes on the left, biggest ones on the right, and what they were plugged up with. And you can see that the mason bees seem to prefer small holes. They're the brown bars. Um, and the leafcutter bees, the bright green bars, like the big holes, which makes perfect sense because leafcutter bees are bigger bees than the red mason bees. The overall takeaway message, I think, is that a mixture of hole sizes is good because then you'll encourage both smaller bees and bigger bees. With hindsight, I wish we'd had even smaller holes of perhaps 5 or 4 millimeter diameter because I think they might be more attractive to things like the large-headed resin bee and the scissor bee and so on. Okay, so to summarize, cardboard, wood, or bamboo is good to make your hotel from. Avoid plastic. Put your hotel on a sunny wall or a fence, not on a tree, facing east or south, and have a range of hole sizes. And hopefully you'll get lots of residents moving in. Now I'm aware I'm running out of time slightly, so I'm going to have to skip a couple of slides. I did want to finish by just mentioning bee bricks, which are often people are encouraged to include in house building. Brighton Council recently passed a bylaw which stipulated that all new houses had to incorporate a bee brick. These are designed to do the same as bee hotels, provide homes for solitary bees. Cost about £30 a brick. There is one published study on these which suggested that the occupancy was between 1 and 3%, which seems to be way lower than our data suggests you can get with conventional bee hotels. That's on an average of less than one occupied one occupied hole per brick, which suggests on the face of it that bee bricks are not perhaps the best investment ever if you want to encourage solitary bees in your garden. Okay, so I need to wrap up. Let me just remind you about the Buzz Club. We're running lots of other projects. I say lots, several other projects. Do check out the website. Um, uh, we would absolutely love it if you take part in one or more of our projects, and even better if you'd consider becoming a sponsor, paying a small amount every month to help support. It's largely Izzy and her time, which is required to run these projects. We don't pay any overheads to the university. Every penny you give us goes on funding these projects, which hopefully will help to build the evidence base so that we can make our gardens as insect friendly as possible into the future. If you want to join the Big Bee Hotel experiment, then there's a QR code that will link you through to the web page where you can sign up. I'll also just jump back a slide and flag up. There's a separate QR code there, which will take you to information about our upcoming webinar about the pollen, nectar, and the seasons that bees need the most by Dr. Kieran Harris, which you might be interested in. So do come along to that. Do sign up for the Big Bee Hotel experiment. And that's it from me. Thank you ever so much for listening.